Today we're going to judge the soldering skills of Reddit. We're going to find some posts that look like people are struggling with learning how to solder, and we're going to give some advice on how really to do it and to do it well. Alright, this person says, first time soldering, rougher than it seemed. It's crazy how when you've been soldering a long time, it just comes like, or it has become like second nature, and you don't really have a rough time anymore. It's hard to remember how rough it was as a beginner. So he says, so I've tried for the first time to solder pins to my new ESP. I've encountered some difficulties, so any tips appreciated. Also tell me if these look okay or not. Two of the problems I encountered were the solder seems to try to stick to the soldering iron, hence the little spikes. And sometimes it seems my tip wasn't heating the pins and the circle around them, even though the temperature was more than enough to melt the solder. Okay, so if the solder's sticking to your tip, that's actually a good thing. You want that. You don't want the little Hershey Kiss kind of effect, making spikes coming off the joint. That usually comes from dwelling with the iron too much to where your time in the joint, your time on the joint has outlived the flux. That's usually why that happens. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means there's room for improvement in your technique. And then sometimes it seems my tip wasn't heating the pins. So that's a heat conductivity thing, and that can be from poor contact, or it can be from the iron not being tinned enough. And so if the iron's not tinned enough, or it's gotten dirty, what I would do is clean it in the brass wool, and then I would put the iron on. And a dry iron doesn't usually heat things up very well because there's not a lot of path for the heat to flow except for that one point of contact. So what you have to do is add solder to the joint and add it to the iron first, but you want to add it so that the solder touches the joint as you add it. You don't want to add it to just the iron. And then that lets the heat conduct. And I don't know about this board. You might want to do a little bit of preheating to make that go a little smoother. But it shouldn't be necessary, especially since it's an ESP. Most of these are probably data lines. I'm sure there's a few power traces and some ground plane connections. Ground plane connections, or any plane connection if it's power or ground, those will take more heat, more time. That's where preheating can be really helpful. But as for these joints, they look like they'll work. It's hard to tell because the pictures aren't great. They look like they'll work, but there's room for improvement, for sure. And there's a lot of flux left over here that should be cleaned up for a nice, neat job. And I don't always clean up my flux. I probably should, but it's just one of those things. If it's a personal project, I don't mind if some flux is left over. I really don't even know if rosin flux is corrosive or not. I've never had an issue with it, so I've always just assumed that it didn't need cleaning up, that it wasn't going to cause corrosion, but that's something I just don't know. It's not something I have needed to, it's not something I've had any trouble with, I'll put it that way. But you can see the flux is splattered all over the place, and that's a sign that you've fed the solder into the joint while heating it really quickly, because that's the flux in the wire just popping and spattering all over the place. And that happens when you give a lot of it at once. So that could explain why a lot of these joints have too much solder. That could explain part of the reason why you have so many of these little spikes coming off of your joints. Because if you add a lot of solder at once, then you have to dwell for a long time to get that solder to adhere to everything. You're running through your flux that you have. You're running through the life of it. It's all evaporating off or burning off. So when you pull the iron away, it wants to pull towards the iron and it wants to pull towards the joint, so you get that effect. Whereas if you were able to not outlive the life of the flux on the joint, that problem would be a lot less apparent or non-existent at all. So what I would recommend is, it looks like you've got plenty of heat. I don't think any of these joints are cold. It's difficult to tell in these pictures. It looks like you got plenty of heat. What I would recommend you do is you start with the iron on the joint that you're going to make, and then you add a little bit of solder to kick off that heat conduction. And then when you add that first little bit, add it little by little. Don't go too fast. You'll get a feel for how fast you can go effectively. But before you get that feel, just add a little bit. That way you're continuously adding more flux as you're adding your solder, but you're not adding too much solder. And then when you think you have enough solder, since you've already preheated the joint and you've added it slowly, you don't have to dwell any longer. You can pull away the iron and let it cool. And don't try to cool it down too quickly. Don't blow on it, though I'm guilty of doing that myself at times. It's better just to let it cool down naturally. And I believe 6337 tin lead will, once it cools all at once, which can help if you're a beginner or you don't have steady hands. 6040, like I use, it cools down a little bit. It cools down gradually, so it'll start solidifying in the coolest place and then work its way to the warmer places as it cools. So that's something I learned recently about how the solder will solidify as it cools. But I'm going to assume you're using 6040, and it's definitely leaded because the joints are shiny. They'd be cloudy if they were lead free. Even if they were good joints, they would still be cloudy. But if you pull away the iron as soon as you have enough solder, doing it the way that I described, you will get a good joint on these through hole pins. And somebody here has shared a graphic that kind of demonstrates what I just described. You want to heat the pin and pad at the same time, then you want to add the solder, and you want to keep it hot for a second or two. And that's really to make sure the solder you just added mixes well with all the rest of the solder, because as you add the solder wire is colder than the rest, so you want to make sure it gets nice and hot. But when you're preheating it like this, you only need 1 to 2 seconds to continue heating, and then you let cool, don't blow. And then so here's a legend here of what you want to, of what you're looking for issues. This right here is perfect. This is too much solder, though too much is better than not enough. This will still work, but you're shooting for this. This, if anything, is just a waste of solder. Although a waste of solder, in the grand scheme of things, isn't the worst thing. You waste a lot of solder when you're desolder, but just something to look out for. If you want good technique, you want this, not this. Not enough solder, cold joint. If there is a very defined or distinct line between your solder and the thing you're soldering to, chances are it's a cold joint. And if you can still see the pad of the through hole or the solder pad that you're soldering to, that didn't get hot all the way and the solder didn't flow, or it did and you didn't give it enough time to flow all the way. You can tell by the way the solder flows into it. If the solder flows into it smoothly, you just didn't give it enough time to flow. If it looks like this graphic does and it's round and kind of looks like a ball sitting on top of the pad, then it didn't get hot enough and your solder didn't stick to it, and this will not work as a joint. And if it works at all, it won't work very long. Too much heat, if you burn around the hole, and burn the PCB material, it can be black and charred, or it'll even look lighter sometimes because it'll bubble up. The bubbles give it a lighter color underneath, and that's not good because it's delaminating the PCB, and you don't want that. And another thing that too much heat can cause is, there's really several things, is the things I just mentioned, but also too much heat can cause your flux to evaporate and burn away too quickly, which means the solder will oxidize while it's still liquid, and you'll end up with what might be a decent joint underneath, but is probably not. And it'll look really bad. It'll look like a cold joint on top because of all that oxidation. Well, it won't look like this cold joint. It'll have a really distinct dirty look that is also usually cold because of the oxidation. And you'll know that when you see it. As you're learning, you've probably already seen it. And the other issue this can cause is it can lift pads and traces because it weakens the glue that's used to hold them on. And then you end up having to make a repair that you weren't going to have to make, and you've made a lot more work for yourself. Yeah, if you're a beginner, it's not a repair you're prepared to make. It'd be good practice, but if it's something that you can't afford to break or lose, I would not want to have to do that. And then obviously you have a short right here. So unless these two things are connected already, connected in the circuit, you don't want them to be connected when you solder them.